Hello boys and girls. Today Auntie Katie's going to read Mr. Fussy by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you settled? Let's begin. Mr. Fussy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Fussy was fussy about everything. Absolutely everything had to be neat and tidy and in its proper place. Mr. Fussy spent all day and every day rearranging his furniture and making sure the flowers grew in a straight line in his garden and trying to find the specks of dust where there couldn't possibly be specks of dust because he spent all his time making sure there weren't any specks of dust. There's Mr. Fussy and his nice even flowers. One fine morning, Mr. Fussy was having breakfast. He was very fussy about what he ate. He opened the marmalade pot. "Ugh!" he exclaimed, "it's got bits in it." And he spent the rest of the morning separating the bits from the marmalade, or, if you prefer, the marmalade from the bits. Fussy old fusspot, people used to call him. There's Mr. Fussy, taking out the bits from the marmalade jar. He's so fussy. Then Mr. Fussy went out into his garden and spent the rest of the day straightening out all the blades of grass on his lawn. Fussy old fusspot. Imagining straightening out all the grass on the lawn. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, ironing his shoelaces, where he heard a crash outside. "What's to do?" he murmured to himself and hurried to investigate. There's Mr. Fussy hurrying to the door to investigate. Oh, this one's a tricky one. Oh, no, it's not. There, with a broken garden gate in one hand, an old battered suitcase in the other, and a sheepish grin on his face, stood an untidy person. Mr. Clumsy. "Whoops," he said, holding up the garden gate. "It came off in my hands." "Who?" spluttered Mr. Fussy, looking in horror at his garden gate. "Are you?" There's Mr. Clumsy, with his shoelaces aren't tied and he's got the garden gate in his hand because it came off. "I'm Mr. Clumsy," replied the untidy person, grinning, and he stepped forward to shake Mr. Fussy's hand, but tripped over and fell on the lawn. There's Mr. Clumsy falling on the lawn. "My grass!" cried Mr. Fussy. "My straight grass! You've bent it!" And then he got down on his hands and knees and started straightening the grass. "But who are you?" he asked over his shoulder. "And why are you here?" "I'm your cousin," replied Mr. Clumsy, "your long-lost cousin from Australia. I know some boys and girls who live in Australia. I've come to visit." There's Mr. Fussy and there's Mr. Clumsy. Mr. Clumsy's from Australia. Auntie Katie's from Australia too, but she lives in Ireland. "Aren't you pleased to see me?" continued Mr. Clumsy cheerfully, knocking over a flower or two as he got up and picked up his suitcase, knocking up another flower or two or three. Mr. Fussy quite obviously wasn't pleased to see him. "You'd better come in," he muttered. There's his nice even house, but the bent flowers that Mr. Fussy bent. "I say," remarked Mr. Clumsy, looking through the front door of Mr. Fussy's house, "I say, what a neat little place you've got here." And he stepped inside and tripped over his shoelace, he often does, and knocked over a chair and dropped his suitcase and fell in an untidy heap on the floor. "Whoops," he said. Mr. Fussy shut his eyes and heaved a sigh and groaned silently to himself. Poor Mr. Fussy. Later that evening, after Mr. Fussy had cooked them a meal and after Mr. Clumsy had helped with the washing up, 2 broken plates, they sat down to talk. There's Mr. Clumsy and the 2 broken plates. Mr. Fussy sat, as he always did, in a neat and tidy fashion. Mr. Clumsy sat, as he always did, in a not so neat and tidy fashion. Which way are you sitting at the moment, boys and girls? "How long are you staying?" asked Mr. Fussy. "Oh, I don't know," grinned Mr. Clumsy. "A few days, a week, a year? I haven't decided. There's Mr. Clumsy sitting on the seat, deciding how long he's going to spend with Mr. Fussy. I think Mr. Fussy would like to see the back of Mr. Clumsy. When he awoke in the morning, Mr. Fussy jumped out of bed and went into his bathroom. "Oh no," he gasped. "Oh no." Oh yes, Mr. Clumsy had been there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor. The bath was full of water. There were pools of water all over the bathroom floor and half a tube of toothpaste. What a mess! Mr. Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he could. There's the toothpaste all over the bathroom floor. Then Mr. Fussy hurried downstairs. "Morning," said his cousin cheerfully. "I've cooked you breakfast. Sit down." There was an awful mess everywhere. "There we are," said Mr. Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, broken fried eggs, towards the table. "Breakfast!" And then he tripped over the shoelaces of his, and the eggs flew through the air, and then they landed all over Mr. Fussy. Sticky, greasy, yellow fried eggs. "Whoops," said Mr. Clumsy. "Oh, there's poor Mr. Fussy with the eggs on his face now, and the plate upside down. Oh, poor Mr. Fussy. It's not easy being with Mr. Clumsy, is it?" After a week, Mr. Fussy's house didn't look like Mr. Fussy's house anymore. "Oh my gosh, look at the house. It's got broken windows, a broken door, a broken roof, broken flowers, broken trees." But after 2 weeks, Mr. Clumsy decided to move on. "Thank you for having me," he said to Mr. Fussy. "It was very nice to see you," replied Mr. Fussy politely. But what he was thinking, "It's very nice to see you going." "Cheerio," said Mr. Clumsy, and off he went with his battered old suitcase. "Goodbye," called Mr. Fussy, really meaning good riddance. Geez, that's not very nice, is it? There's Mr. Fussy and there's Mr. Clumsy. They do look a bit alike. Then Mr. Fussy fussed around his house as he'd never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot, polishing and mending and repairing and straightening and sorting out and cleaning and putting everything back exactly as it had been before Mr. Clumsy had come to stay. He even dusted the flowers in the garden. There's Mr. Fussy dusting the flowers in the garden. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen polishing an egg when he heard a crash outside. "Oh no," he groaned, "not Mr. Clumsy back again. It can't be. It mustn't be. It isn't." And it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody who had just walked straight through Mr. Fussy's garden gate. Someone who can't help having little accidents. And somebody you may have met before. Do you know who it is, boys and girls? "Hello," smiled Mr. Bump. "I've come to visit." Poor Mr. Fussy. There we go, boys and girls. Mr. Fussy by Roger Hargreaves.